Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Barnes and I graduated from U of M's Clinical Psych program in 2020. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you all in person or live virtually today, but I want to thank you for having me for this presentation. I'm going to be talking today primarily about my research article for which I won the Vineberg Prize, which is a meta-analysis evaluating the relationship between maternal depression and infant attachment security. This article was based off a subsection of my master's thesis, which was a meta-analysis looking at the relationship between various different types of maternal psychopathology and infant attachment security. So this article was published in 2019 in the Infant Mental Health Journal. And then I'm going to conclude with a discussion of some future directions for research, including how this led to the development of my PhD dissertation. So I'm just going to start off by briefly reviewing some of the background in this area. Attachment theory explains how the early relationship developed between an infant and their primary caregiver shapes the infant's development and is a foundation for the later relationships in their life. These internal working models are highly resistant to change, with attachment being found to remain moderately stable from infancy to adulthood. These models are thought to develop based off the caregiver's reactions to the infant during critical times of need. When an infant is distressed, he or she will display behaviors that are meant to signal to the caregiver a need for comfort. If the infant's distress is consistently met with responsiveness from their caregiver, they will come to expect and know that their caregiver will be there for them. This is considered to be the development of a secure attachment style. However, not all infant caregiver interactions result in secure attachments. If not provided with the appropriate responsiveness from their caregiver, infants can develop a non-secure attachment, which can be further broken down into a number of categories, including a number of anxious attachment styles and a disorganized attachment style. There are many possible risk factors that can go into the creation of a non-secure attachment relationship between an infant and their mother, but the factor that has been most strongly supported and consistently linked with attachment is a mother's sensitivity, which is a mother's ability to perceive her infant's signals and respond to them appropriately. Non-secure attachment styles have been linked to a variety of issues in a child's development and into adulthood. They have been found to be a risk factor in the development of externalizing disorders and internalizing disorders in children. And this risk factor also extends further into the lifespan, with non-secure attachment orientations being linked to poor peer relationships, criminal behaviors, and increased suicidal ideation. The overwhelming conclusion has been that maternal psychological distress, regardless of its form, has a prevalent and enduring influence on fetal, infant, and child development. There has been evidence to support the idea that mental disorders have an impact on a mother's interactions with her child. And this is why my original master's thesis actually examined all forms of maternal psychopathology, not just depression. However, the vast majority of the studies that I did locate were on maternal depression. We know that depressive disorders are characterized by mood that is sad, empty, or irritable, and is usually accompanied by both cognitive and somatic changes that impact on a person's everyday functioning. So it likely makes sense that research has shown that mothers who are experiencing depression are often unable to provide sensitivity and responsivity to their child. Research has also demonstrated that mothers suffering from depression display less affectionate contact behavior with their infant, are less responsive to the cues of their infant, and are withdrawn with flatness of affect. So moving on to my article. The rationale behind the study was that while various strong studies have been conducted to examine the relationship between maternal depression and child attachment, little consensus on the nature of this relationship has been reached. While some studies have found quite significant effects, others have found more negligible effects. In addition, there had been 3 previous meta-analyses that had been conducted on this topic, but all of them were quite outdated. All 3 of them were conducted in the year 2000. One of these meta-analyses was quite small, using only 6 studies, and found that maternal depression was strongly associated with increased avoidant and disorganized attachment. A more inclusive meta-analysis conducted in the same year included 15 studies and found a weak but significant relationship between maternal depression and attachment non-security. And a third meta-analysis, which used many of the same studies, but looked specifically at disorganized attachment, found no overall support for the relationship between maternal depression and this specific form of attachment non-security. So I want to do a meta-analysis on this relationship to hopefully provide a statistical and quantitative consensus, which would also allow for an investigation into possible moderators of this relationship. So through these analyses, this study aimed to clarify the relationship between maternal depression and child attachment security. So the main objectives of my study were first to determine the overall relationship between maternal depression and non-secure child attachment orientations through looking at prevalence, odds ratios, correlations, and standardized mean differences. And secondly, to examine the effects of various moderators, both of the participants and of the studies, on this relationship. So leading off that, my four main research questions were, first, what is the rate of non-secure attachment in infants of mothers with depression? Secondly, do infants of mothers with depression have increased odds of non-secure attachment orientations compared to infants of mothers who are psychologically healthy? Third, how large is the association between maternal depressive symptoms and infant attachment non-security? And lastly, do infants and mothers with depression have greater levels of attachment non-security than infants and mothers without any psychopathology? And then my fifth research question was whether there were any variables that affected the odds of non-secure attachment in infants and mothers with depression compared to infants and mothers who were psychologically healthy. I examined a number of different variables, including participant variables, so characteristics of the sample itself, such as infant gender composition or the treatment status of the mother, as well as study variables, such as whether the study was published or unpublished, the country it was published in, and the different attachment and depression measures that were used. So moving on through my methodology, a systematic search was conducted following the guidelines for the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, or PRISMA, to determine the identification, screening, and eligibility of the studies that were to be included. An extensive literature search was the first step undertaken, where both published and unpublished studies were systematically searched for in each of 6 main databases. The search strategy included a combination of keywords that was meant to capture all possible relevant studies related to infant attachment and maternal depression. And a secondary search was also then conducted in an attempt to find any additional studies that were not found through that primary search. So that included both backwards and forward searches. Eligibility criteria were developed to determine if each of the studies would be included in the meta-analysis. These criteria were adjusted as needed as the eligibility process was undertaken. So first, the study had to include a quantitative consideration of the relationship between a mother's depressive status or symptoms and an infant's attachment orientation classification, either between a maternal depression group and a comparison group or within a maternal depression group. Secondly, the study had to include a direct measure or diagnosis of maternal depression or maternal depressive symptoms, as opposed to a more indirect or related measure such as stress, coping style, emotion regulation. And this depression measure had to be taken in the postnatal rather than the prenatal period. The study also had to include a quantitative infant attachment outcome, such as the strain situation procedure or other comparable attachment classification system, such as the attachment Q-sort. And it could result in either categorical or continuous outcomes of attachment. Offspring participants had to be between the ages of 0 and 36 months, as this is the age range that is covered by the majority of young attachment research, and it's the oldest age that could be assessed by the traditional strain situation procedure. And finally, the studies could not have exclusively focused on special populations of infants, such as preterm infants or those with developmental disabilities. So I'm going to walk through this PRISMA flow diagram to illustrate the number of studies that were included and excluded at each stage of this screening process. So the primary search results from the 6 databases yielded over 12,000 results. Backwards and forward searches yielded only 2 additional studies. So this gave us a lot of confidence that our primary search strategy had been very thorough and would have captured all of the relevant studies. The results from different databases were then compared in order to remove any duplicates. So once duplicates were removed, 8,130 unique studies remained, and these unique studies were then screened for eligibility based on their title and abstract. So 7,939 were excluded at that point, which left us with the remaining 191 studies that appeared eligible based on their title and abstract. So these were moved into full manuscript review. These potential studies were read in full to verify if they did meet all the eligibility criteria. 133 studies did not meet all the eligibility criteria and were excluded from the analyses. And there were many reasons for exclusion. Some of them included overlapping samples, infant age that was not within the defined range, insufficient measures of attachment or depression, or psychopathology other than depression. So this meant that there was a total of 42 studies that were deemed to be eligible and that were included in the final quantitative synthesis. The research questions were used to create a coding manual, which was used as a guide to code all of the eligible studies. So data from each eligible study was recorded onto a corresponding coding form. In terms of statistical analyses, a random effects model was used for this meta-analysis because this approach, which assumes heterogeneity across the studies, is considered to be the most widely applicable and conservative model. The data from the coding forms was entered into the CMA software, and primary individual meta-analyses were performed to address each of the main research objectives. So for research question 1, the overall rate of non-secure attachment in infants and mothers with depression was computed. For research question 2, an odds ratio effect size was calculated to examine the relative odds of the presence of non-secure attachment in children of mothers with depression compared to children of mothers without depression. For research question 3, correlation between severity of maternal depressive symptoms and attachment security was calculated. And finally, for research question 4, a standardized mean difference, in this case Cohen's d, was used. Finally, all moderator analyses were conducted using meta-regression on research question 2. So moving through my results, first in terms of characteristics of the studies that were included. Out of the 42 studies that met the inclusion criteria, 31 of those were published articles and 11 were unpublished. The majority of the studies were conducted in the United States, with a handful of studies kind of sprinkled throughout a number of other countries, including a couple from Canada. They were published between 1984 and 2014. The percentage of female children ranged from 39 to 62%, and the mean age of the children ranged from 12 to 36 months. The mean age of the mothers was 16 to 36 years. The percent of white mothers in the study ranged from 0 to 100%, and the majority of the studies used the strange situation procedure. The remainder used the attachment Q-sort or a variation of that measure. So for research question 1, the rate of attachment non-security in infants and mothers with depression was found to be 57%. For research question 2, infants and mothers with depression had 1.8 times the odds of having a non-secure attachment relationship compared to infants of mothers without depression. For research question 3, the relationship between overall maternal depressive symptoms and infant attachment security was small but significant, indicating that with increased symptomology, attachment non-security also increased. And finally, interestingly, the results of 2 studies indicate that infants of mothers with depression did not have significantly greater levels of attachment non-security, so they didn't have lower scores on the continuous attachment measures compared to infants of mothers without depression. However, there were only 2 studies that were eligible to be included in this particular analysis. Finally, individual meta-regressions were conducted for 9 moderator variables to determine if any of them explained any of the variability in the findings. All moderator analyses were performed on research question 2, as this allowed for the moderators to be tested on 28 possible studies, and the number of eligible studies for any given variable ranged from 9 to 28. So using the Q statistic and univariate models, only 2 of the moderators were found to be significant. The first was maternal sample source, with clinical samples yielding larger effect sizes than community samples. So there you can see that the odds ratio for clinical samples was 2.7 versus the odds ratio for community samples, which was closer to 1.3. And the other moderator that was found to be significant was the depression measure that was used. So interestingly, studies that used both diagnostic and self-report measures yield us the largest effect sizes, followed by studies that only used self-report measures, and then followed by studies that only used diagnostic measures. The remainder of the moderators, so everything else that I looked at, was not found to be significant. So research studies have shown that in non-clinical samples, approximately 35% of children in the United States and around the world are classified as non-secure, though the breakdown of the type of non-security varies. And the current meta-analysis found that 57% of infants with mothers with depression are non-securely attached. So it's really important for us to consider the implications of a 20% higher rate of attachment non-security among infants of mothers with depression. And the results of this meta-analysis have demonstrated that maternal depression is definitely associated with higher rates of attachment non-security, despite some individual studies that have argued the contrary. One of the most significant outcomes of this meta-analysis was that it demonstrated that infants of mothers with depression had significantly higher odds, nearly double, of having a non-secure attachment relationship compared to infants of mothers who are psychologically healthy. And importantly, when we think back to the moderator analysis of sample, for clinical samples, that was even higher. It was nearly triple the odds. In addition, the relationship between infant attachment non-security and maternal depressive symptoms was small but significant, indicating that with increased severity of maternal depressive symptoms, so for example, higher scores on the BDI, infant attachment non-security also increased. These results are consistent with the majority of the literature examining the effects of maternal depression on infant development and mother-infant interactions. The symptoms that commonly define depression tend to have a profound impact on individuals' interpersonal behavior, including emotional expressiveness and responsiveness. So it's reasonable to expect that maternal depression will impact mothers' interpersonal functioning with their infants, which will then negatively impact infants' development. The effects of depression on mothers' interpersonal functioning have been shown to result in lowered sensitivity to their infants. And as maternal sensitivity is often considered to be a necessary component for the development of a secure attachment relationship, the current results of increased rates of attachment non-security in this population of mothers with depression should not be surprising. Additionally, only 2 moderators were found to be significant. So first, studies that use both types of depression measures had larger effect sizes. This is really important to note because we do tend to think that using multiple methods for collecting data is optimal when making a diagnosis. So this result is definitely supportive of that idea. And likely not surprisingly, larger effect sizes were also found for clinical samples than community samples, which makes sense as we would expect that in clinical samples, there would likely be more significant depressive symptoms and a greater impact on functioning. The results of this meta-analysis provide a greater understanding of the relationship between maternal depression and infant attachment security. The results of the study provided an update on this relationship and clarified some of the discrepancies in the literature by supporting the notion that there is definitely a clear and significant relationship between maternal depression and the development of non-secure attachment orientations in their children. It also allowed the identification of some significant moderating variables, such as the importance of sample and measure selection in these types of studies. And the implications of this meta-analysis suggest to clinicians that mothers with depression may be at risk for interacting with their infants in negative ways, and it is a risk factor for the development of non-secure attachment. This information could be used to support the integration of universal screening for maternal depression in the postpartum periods, so that mothers that are found to be at risk could be offered early interventions, which focus not just on improving maternal mental health, but also on enhancing this attachment relationship. So I want to conclude with the last few minutes by discussing some important future directions. Firstly, interestingly, despite the strong link between maternal depression and infant attachment non-security, there was still a sizable number of infants of depressed mothers who were still classified as secure. Further investigations into what is protective about these children, such as infant characteristics like temperament, as well as environmental factors such as level of support or the role of fathers, which promote security despite depression, would be helpful to more fully understand the effects of maternal depression on the infant-mother dyad. As mentioned, my original master's thesis attempted to examine many types of psychopathologies rather than just depression, but there was unfortunately a very low number of studies that examined any other types of psychopathologies. So that included maternal anxiety, substance use, personality disorders, psychosis, and most interestingly to me, trauma and PTSD. So this really highlights the need for there to be further primary research done investigating the impacts of other types of maternal mental health difficulties on infant attachment security. That's a huge gap in the literature right now. And this is what actually led me to my doctoral dissertation, which was a primary research study examining the impact of maternal trauma on infant attachment security within refugee families in Canada. So while unfortunately I don't have much time to talk about this, I did just want to end by talking for a minute briefly about my dissertation, because I think it shows a really helpful application of further research branching out from the article that I've been discussing today. And it's also been my passion for the last few years, so I thought I would squeeze it in here. So very briefly, I recruited 36 mother-child pairs of refugees in Canada. I met with these families in their home for about 3-hour visits. And during that visit, I would have a mother complete a number of different measures. And that included the Beck Depression Inventory and the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire. And we also completed the attachment Q-sort. So myself and a research assistant, when possible, would observe lots of different behaviors and interactions between the mother and the child, both while she completed the questionnaires and for a bit of time afterwards. And interestingly, what we found was that in this sample, there was actually no correlations at all between maternal depression and attachment, or even with maternal trauma and attachment, which was certainly not what I was expecting, and especially not after having conducted this meta-analysis. However, there was a strong correlation between child attachment and child behavior problems, including both internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And what I ended up finding was that child attachment security significantly moderated the relationship between maternal trauma and externalizing behaviors, though it didn't have the same effect on internalizing behaviors. So my hypotheses on why that's the case is a whole nother talk, but I just wanted to kind of highlight this as an example because I think that attachment in the context of maternal mental health is incredibly important for us to consider. And there might be some very nuanced, important ways that it can be impacting the system. So it's really worth researching from as many angles as we possibly can. So I just wanted to end by thanking the numerous funding sources that made this research possible, as well as my amazing advisor, Dr. Tooley, who was also a co-author on this publication. Thank you to the Research and Selection Committee, or the Research and Scholarship Committee, for selecting my publication for this award. And since I'm not with you live, I've included my email address on the last slide here. So please feel free to reach out if you have any comments or questions from my talk today. I would love to connect or hear from any of you. And thank you very much.